It is about 10 p.m. here, and I just got back from Caught Stealing, which is the new movie by Darren Aronofsky.
Who are you? What's the baby, man?
It stars Austin Butler as this down on his luck former baseball player who is trying to get by in New York City and who gets caught up in this strange, twisty plot that gets him involved with all these bad and dangerous figures, and who basically has to deal with this big dose of bad fortune.
What the hell happened?
So, for starters, I think this is a great looking film. It is set in the late 90s, and it definitely feels like a movie that came out in those years. It has a very gritty, grungy feeling to it. It's very tactile, very textured, in a way that just feels very true to that era. There's also some great use of drones. And yeah, overall, it's just a very aesthetically pleasing movie, and one that very quickly brings you into a world that you want to spend some time in.
I want to know if I can take this seriously.
What do you need to take us seriously?
As for the story, I wasn't entirely sure what this was going to be in the first 10 to 15 minutes or so. I had seen one of the trailers, only partially, I think, and so I knew roughly kind of what genre it was going to be, but I didn't know exactly what the plot was going to be. And the problem in this sense is that the main character is basically this very passive protagonist who has stuff happen to him, and that's very much the first, in some ways it's like the first hour or so of the movie, but especially in the opening minutes, the first act or so, it's hard to get a sense of where this movie is going, because it doesn't feel like the protagonist has any direction himself. You know, he mostly feels like a guy who's just trying to get by, who's trying to get left alone by these thugs that keep chasing him.
Either I get what I want or my pistol stuck from me.
So basically the plot is that one of his neighbors goes to London to visit his dying father, and he leaves his cat with Austin Butler's character, and then some bad guys show up wanting something from this other tenant, and that's how they end up harassing Austin Butler's character. I'm forgetting what his name was in the movie. And so basically he is burdened with the problem of someone else. He has to find this thing or whatever it was. You know, he just wants to be left alone. He wants to have this over with. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but that does mean that when you identify yourself with a main character who doesn't have a direction in the story, it also makes the story feel a little bit directionless. But as things move along, you get a better sense of who Austin Butler's character is, what he went through in the past. And that, to me, is when it became more clear that this is basically a story about what happens when something bad happens to someone who already is in a bad place, and the way unresolved trauma hurts our decision-making in the present, which in turn affects those around us. In this sense, it feels very true to Darren Aronofsky's general style and interests. You know, a lot of his movies deal with addiction, with trauma, obsessions, that kind of stuff. All these things that damage people in the long run, and that leave these long-lasting scars in people's psyches that they then have to deal with whenever a new conflict occurs or whenever a new obstacle comes in their way. And I think that's kind of the angle from which I got the most out of this movie. Not everything about it worked for me, especially the idea that Austin Butler's, I'm sorry, I keep using the actor's name, but I'm blanking on the character name. Austin Butler's character pretty much hinges on this one specific event from his past, which from a narrative point of view is a little bit predictable, because you can quickly sense where it is going. You can quickly sense that, there's something that's going to happen in the current story that's going to help him move past whatever happened years ago. And that revelation is going to be the main transformation of him as a character, and indeed that's kind of, without spoiling it, but that's kind of the arc, as you expected, is kind of the arc as it plays out. Probably my biggest issue, though, was with the way Aronofsky handled the tone of the movie. Because, with Aronofsky in general, like my one complaint probably about his filmmaking philosophy is that his movies tend to feel very like heavy-handed, very, very much having this sort of somberness to it that just makes it all feel very self-serious, very, again, heavy-handed. I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, but there's just something that feels heavy about his movies that often sort of keep me from coming back to them. There's a lot of movies of his that I genuinely appreciate and that I like to think about and talk about. The Fountain's probably my favorite of his. Black Swan also, but I think Black Swan was more befitting of such a heavy, somber, dark kind of atmosphere. But, even with The Fountain, for example, I felt like that movie could have benefited from a little bit more tree of life type wonder. And especially with this movie, where it feels like he channeled a lot of like Guy Ritchie or even early Martin Scorsese. I watched After Hours a couple of days ago for the first time, which has a somewhat similar story where you have this guy who ends up in a dark neighborhood in New York and he's trying to get home, but everything keeps going wrong. He keeps getting like falling into this bad fortune or these bad situations. But that movie was just, I just had like the biggest smile while watching that, because it was like a beautiful nightmare. And Caught Stealing, I think, had some of that, and there were moments where I think it was genuinely funny, especially with some of the side characters. And there were also plenty of moments where it was very like electrifying, very upbeat in a very entertaining way. But then on the other hand, there were also a lot of choices, especially things that happened in the plot, but also just sort of tonally, where the movie would suddenly get a lot more serious. I won't go into spoilers, but if you've seen the movie, you probably know there's a couple of moments where things suddenly turn from this sort of wacky adventure into a very real and very dramatic situation. And I'm not sure if the movie always balanced that as well as it could be. It felt like he was trying to make a Guy Ritchie movie, but then kind of paddled back halfway through. And so, yeah, that's just something that on a first impression, I'm not feeling entirely sure about. Like, I'm not sure. I was like in the moment of the movie, I wasn't sure how I was supposed to feel emotionally. Like, is this a kind of fun, absurdist, almost comedic misadventure, or is this a very serious story about trauma and addiction and loss and so on? And something that, is this a story that takes itself very seriously, or is this a story and a character that we can laugh at a little? Or maybe it can be both. Maybe that works for some people, but for me, that synergy wasn't quite there, at least not after watching it the first time. But I will say that the third act is where a lot of things do come together better, and where the tone does reach some kind of unified crescendo that made for a very exhilarating finale, and one that I felt was pretty satisfying, or at least as satisfying as it could be after everything that happened beforehand. And so, yeah, overall, I do feel it was an enjoyable experience, an overall meaningful story, but I'm just not sure yet if it quite balanced itself out tonally in a way that will have me appreciating this a lot more in the future.
Eat, skinny boy.
Eat or you're gonna upset her.
By the way, I'm not sure if you already know this, but on my Patreon page, I do a monthly exclusive film discussion, kind of in this format, but a little bit more in-depth and with spoilers. The last one was about James Gunn's Superman, but I've also talked about Sinners, Warfare, Nosferatu. I think there was another one. But anyways, the upcoming one is about The House That Jack Built by Lars von Trier, which is just one of those movies that's that's just too tricky to talk about on YouTube, because it's about this serial killer, and it's very much from the perspective of the serial killer. It's extremely dark, but for some reason I find it a fascinating movie, and I've been meaning to rewatch it. So for the next exclusive Patreon video, that's the one that I'm gonna cover.
Some people claim that the atrocities we commit in our fiction are those inner desires which we cannot commit in our controlled civilization. So they are expressed instead through our art.
So if you want to check that out, feel free to head on over to my Patreon page. Supporting that also really helps out with the channel. Not just this one, but especially the main channel where I make the proper video essays, so to say. So yeah, that's enough for tonight. Let me know what you thought about God Stealing. Did you enjoy it? How did you feel about the sort of tonal balance? And yeah, I'll see you again in the next one. Bye.